I never truly understood my mother's choices until much later in life. As a child, I watched her endure the worst kind of love, one laced with bruises, with whispered apologies that never held any weight, with hands that knew how to comfort just as well as they knew how to destroy. I used to sit in my small bedroom, clutching my pillow as I heard the muffled sobs from the kitchen, the low voice of my father, words blurred with anger and control. "You made me do this?" he would say. "If you just listened, this wouldn't happen." I remember looking at my mother the morning after, the way she covered up her bruises with makeup, the way she smiled at me as if nothing had happened. "Go to school, darling, I'll be fine." And she was, at least in her mind. To her, love meant endurance. Staying meant loyalty. I was too young to understand why she didn't leave, too young to realize that sometimes the strongest prisons are the ones we build ourselves. But I made a promise to myself. I would never become her. I would never stay with a man who saw love as a possession, who measured affection in the ways he could break me. I would be different. And so I ran. The day I turned 18, I packed my bags and left for the city. Boston felt like a different world. Loud, relentless, and alive. It was a place where no one knew my name, where no one looked at me with pity, where I could finally be free from the shadow of my childhood. I threw myself into work, into building a life I could call my own. I studied, I pushed forward, I created a version of myself that no longer had to look over her shoulder in fear. Over the years, I became strong and independent. I had a job in a small marketing firm, a cozy apartment, and a routine that kept me grounded. And then, I met him. Aaron was everything I had convinced myself love should be. He walked into my life with a confidence that was effortless, a smile that made me forget to breathe. A dentist with a sharp mind and an even sharper suit, he carried himself like a man who had never once been told no. I met him at a networking event, one I almost skipped. I had never been good at small talk, but something about the way he looked at me made me feel like the most interesting person in the room. He laughed at my dry humor and held the door open for me, and when he asked for my number, I gave it without hesitation. The first few weeks were intoxicating. He planned elaborate dates, sent flowers to my office, and always made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. "You're different," he told me once, tracing circles on my wrist. "You're not like the others." And I wanted to believe him. With Aaron, I felt safe. I felt seen. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I had found a love untouched by pain. He was attentive and thoughtful. He remembered the small details, how I took my coffee, the way I liked to sit by the window when it rained, the books that lined my shelves. "I want to know everything about you," he said once, and I let him. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to be vulnerable. I introduced him to my closest friends, Claire and Josh, the two people who had become my family since moving to Boston. They were my safe space, my reality check. Claire, with her sharp wit and unfiltered honesty, was the first to raise an eyebrow at Aaron. "He's charming, sure," she said, swirling her wine, "but something about him feels intense." Josh, ever the skeptic, simply shrugged. "Just be careful, Em." But I didn't want to be careful. I wanted to be happy. I had spent so many years running from the past that I never truly let myself embrace the present. So when Aaron held my hand, when he whispered promises of forever, I let myself believe in them. I ignored the way he sometimes got too serious too quickly, the way his compliments carried an undercurrent of possession. "You don't need anyone else when you have me." It felt like devotion. I mistook it for love. But love shouldn't make you feel like you owe someone your existence. Looking back now, I realize the warning signs were always there. The way he wanted to know where I was at all times, the way his jaw tightened when another man looked at me for too long. But in those moments, I convinced myself it was just a side effect of passion. Aaron loved me. And love, I told myself, should feel overwhelming. I never thought to ask. Overwhelming in what way? At first, Aaron was everything I had ever wanted. He knew how to command a room, not in an arrogant way, but in a way that made people stop and listen. His confidence was effortless, his ambition undeniable. Patients trusted him with their smiles, colleagues respected his precision, and I was drawn to the way he looked at me, as if I was the only person in the world. With him, life felt lighter. He made me laugh in ways I hadn't in years, peeling back the layers of my guarded self with patience and charm. He noticed things, small things that others overlooked. How I always hesitated before ordering food, as if torn between what I wanted and what I should get. How I ran my fingers along the edges of my notebook when deep in thought. How I avoided talking about my childhood, changing the subject with a practiced ease. "I want to know everything about you," he had whispered once, his fingers tracing slow circles on my wrist. And for the first time in my life, I wanted to let someone in. But love has a way of blinding us to the things we don't want to see. It started subtly, so subtly that I didn't even register it as a red flag. The first time I mentioned going out with Claire and Josh, he smiled, tight, controlled. "I just don't understand why you need to spend time with them when we barely see each other," he said. His voice was soft, reasonable. I laughed, brushing it off. "We spend plenty of time together. But don't you think relationships need exclusivity? Prioritization?" His fingers played with a loose thread on my sweater, his eyes searching mine. "I just want to be the most important person in your life." It sounded romantic at the time. Little things became habits. He would ask me where I was, who I was with, what time I'd be home. At first it felt like care. Then it felt like surveillance. But I ignored it. Because he loved me. Because I loved him. Because love wasn't supposed to be perfect all the time. Then there was the night that changed everything. We were at my apartment, curled up on the couch after dinner. I had been telling him about work, about how my team had been preparing for a big campaign. "Elliot helped me finish the last report just before the deadline," I said casually, taking a sip of wine. Aaron's body tensed beside me. "Elliot?" I frowned. "Yeah, my coworker. You've met him before." A beat of silence. Then, with an unsettling calmness, "Why didn't you tell me you were working late with him?" I blinked, caught off guard. "Because it wasn't important?" Aaron exhaled sharply, setting his glass down with a little too much force. "It's important to me, Emilia." A strange tightness coiled in my chest. "Aaron, we were in a group. It wasn't just him and me." His jaw clenched. "It doesn't matter." Something about the way he looked at me sent a shiver down my spine. There was no warmth in his eyes now, only something cold and possessive. "Aaron," I started, but before I could finish, his fingers wrapped around my wrist, tight, unrelenting. I gasped. For a split second, I saw something else in him. Not the man who made me laugh, not the man who held me like I was something precious. I saw something darker, something that reminded me of my father. And then, as quickly as it happened, it was gone. Aaron released me as if he had been burned, his face twisting with horror. "God, Emilia, I'm so sorry." His hands trembled. I didn't mean to. I don't know what came over me." I cradled my wrist, my heart pounding. "I would never hurt you," he continued, his voice thick with guilt. "I swear, it'll never happen again." I wanted to believe him, because the alternative, that the man I loved was capable of this, was too much to bear. Memories of my mother flashed before me. The way she covered bruises, the way she made excuses for my father. But Aaron wasn't my father. He was good. He was kind. He had just lost control. I forced a smile, even though my hands were still shaking. "I know." His relief was immediate. He kissed my knuckles, murmuring promises against my skin. "I'll be better. I love you. I love you. I love you." And I let him pull me into his arms, because sometimes love makes you blind to the things you don't want to see. At first, it was just small things. I glanced at my phone when I wasn't looking. A question disguised as a casual curiosity. "Who texted you?" That never quite felt like an accusation, but never felt innocent either. I told myself it was normal for couples to be transparent with each other. That love meant openness. But love, I was beginning to realize, was not supposed to feel like surveillance. I caught him reading my messages once. I had left my phone on the nightstand while I was in the shower, and when I stepped out, I saw him. Head bent, screen glowing against his face, his fingers scrolling through my conversations. "Aaron?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. He looked up, completely unfazed. "Why didn't you tell me Elliot texted you again?" I stared at him, my heart hammering in my chest. "Because it wasn't important." His jaw was clenched. "It is to me." Something in me twisted uncomfortably. "That's my phone, Aaron," he scoffed, tossing it onto the bed. "What, you have something to hide?" I wanted to argue, to tell him that privacy and secrecy were not the same thing. But I could already see the storm brewing behind his eyes, the way his hands flexed at his sides. So I took the easier route. "I'm sorry," I said. And just like that, the tension dissolved. He kissed my forehead, his fingers gentle now as they tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. "I just love you so much, Emilia. I don't want to share you with anyone." For a while I let myself believe it was love. But love should not feel like possession. His jealousy became a living thing between us. Every smile I exchanged with a male colleague was scrutinized. Every conversation with a male friend required an explanation. His questions became sharper, his tone harsher. I started filtering my words, thinking twice before I mentioned someone's name. I stopped responding to messages when I was with him because it wasn't worth the fight. Then came the anger. It flared up unpredictably, like a fire sparked from nothing. A misplaced phone charger. A dinner reservation that was 5 minutes late. A comment he misinterpreted. One night, I accidentally knocked over a glass of wine onto the couch. It was nothing, just a minor mistake, a stain that could be cleaned. But something in him snapped. "Jesus Christ, Emilia, can you be more careful?" His voice was sharp, his hands curled into fists. "I'm sorry, But before I could finish, he grabbed the empty glass and hurled it against the wall. The shattering sound echoed through the apartment. My entire body went still. Aaron stared at the broken shards, his chest rising and falling heavily. His face was a storm of emotions, rage, regret, something I couldn't quite name. And then, as if the moment had never happened, he exhaled, ran a hand through his hair and muttered, "I need to cool off." I spent the next hour cleaning the broken glass in silence. I told myself it was an isolated incident, that it wouldn't happen again. I was wrong. The night it escalated, I should have seen it coming. We had been arguing. Over what? I don't even remember. The fights had become so frequent that they blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last. But I remember the way his voice rose, the way his face twisted with something ugly and unfamiliar. I remember how, before I could react, his hands were on my shoulders, shoving me. It wasn't a hard push. Not enough to leave a bruise, not enough to be considered real harm. But it was enough. Enough for me to stumble back, enough for me to hit the floor. For a moment there was only silence. Aaron's eyes went wide. He stepped back as if he couldn't believe what he had just done. "Oh God," he whispered. I could feel the sting in my palms from where they had caught my fall. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow. Then, in an instant, he was on his knees beside me. "Baby, I'm so sorry," he choked out, reaching for me. "I didn't mean it, I swear. I lost control. Please don't be afraid of me." I should have walked away right then. I should have gotten up and left and never looked back. But I didn't. Instead, I let him pull me into his arms, let him whisper apologies into my hair, let him kiss my forehead, and let him swear it would never happen again. I wanted to believe him, because if I didn't, then I would have to admit that I was in love with someone who could hurt me, that I was trapped, that I had become my mother. And I wasn't ready to face that truth. Not yet. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Aaron's steady breathing beside me. My body felt foreign, as if it no longer belonged to me. My mind raced, replaying my mother's words over and over again. Love is sacrifice, Emilia. No, love should not feel like fear. The next morning, I packed a bag. I told Aaron I needed to visit my mother, that I hadn't seen her in too long. He smiled, kissed me goodbye, and told me to hurry back. I didn't tell him that I wasn't sure if I would. The town hadn't changed. It still smelled of damp earth and old wood, the air thick with the scent of pine and rain-soaked pavement. The houses stood in quiet rows, their white picket fences worn by time, their curtains drawn as if shielding themselves from the memories trapped inside. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I turned onto my childhood street. My mother's house loomed at the end, small and unassuming, its front porch light flickering despite the daylight. I hadn't been back in years, not because I didn't miss her, but because this place held ghosts I had spent my whole life trying to outrun. The door creaks as I step inside. The house smelled the same, faint traces of lavender from the old diffuser by the window, the lingering warmth of something baking in the oven. The familiarity was suffocating. And then, there she was. My mother stood in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, her face lighting up in surprise as she saw me. "Emilia?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Hi, Mom." She wiped her hands on her apron and rushed toward me, pulling me into a tight embrace. She was smaller than I remembered, her frame more fragile, as if time had worn her down inch by inch. But her touch was the same, gentle, unwavering, full of a love that had endured more than it should have. "You should have told me you were coming," she scolded lightly, holding my face in her hands, searching for something in my eyes. "Are you okay?" I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell her that I was fine, that I had simply missed her, that this visit was nothing more than nostalgia pulling me back. But my silence was enough of an answer. She led me to the small dining table, the same one where I had spent countless nights as a child, staring at my untouched plate while listening to the distant sound of my father's anger vibrating through the walls. I took a deep breath. "I heard about Dad." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "It's been almost a year now." A year. He had been gone for a year, and yet in this house his presence still lingered. "Do you miss him?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. My mother sighed, tucking a strand of graying hair behind her ear. "Of course I do." The response was immediate, certain. I clenched my hands beneath the table. "After everything he did to you?" She didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a soft, wistful thing that made my stomach twist. "He wasn't always like that." I exhaled sharply, my patience fraying. "Mom, he hurt you. Over and over again. How can you sit here and talk about him like he was some kind of—" "Because I loved him, Emilia," she interrupted, her voice calm, steady. "Because I didn't know how to live any other way." Her words were a slap to the face. I stared at her, trying to find some trace of regret, some sign that she wished things had been different. But there was none. She had accepted it. Accepted the pain, the bruises, the years of silence. She had wrapped herself in it like an old coat, too worn and familiar to take off. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. She never left because she didn't believe she could. Because, in her mind, love and suffering were two sides of the same coin. And suddenly I saw myself. I saw the way I flinched when Aaron raised his voice. The way I excused his anger, his control, his moments of cruelty. The way I convinced myself that love was supposed to be overwhelming, consuming, all-encompassing, even when it hurt. I was becoming her. A sharp breath left my lips. "I don't want to live like this," I whispered, more to myself than to her. She reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "Then don't." I lifted my gaze, searching hers. "How?" She smiled sadly. "By knowing that you deserve more." My throat tightened. For so long I had told myself that I was different from her, that I would never make the same mistakes. But standing here, in this house, in the presence of the woman who had endured so much, I realized I was already on the same path. If I stayed with Aaron, I would be sitting in this very chair 20 years from now, telling my own daughter that love was about endurance, not happiness. I refused to let that happen. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the wooden floor. My mother watched me, her expression unreadable. "Are you leaving already?" I nodded. "I have to go back." She rose to her feet, following me to the door. As I stepped onto the porch, the cool air biting at my skin, she called after me. "Emilia." I turned. Her gaze softened. "You don't have to live like me. Don't let love become a prison." I felt something inside me crack. I gave her one last nod before stepping into my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I knew what I had to do. I was going back to Boston. And this time, I wasn't just running, I was leaving. The test sat on the bathroom counter, its single pink line turning into two. I couldn't breathe. The walls of my apartment, usually small but familiar, felt like they were closing in on me. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the sink, forcing myself to stay upright. My reflection in the mirror was pale and hollow-eyed as if I had seen a ghost. Because in a way I had. A part of me had been ready to leave. I had spent days crafting my exit plan, lining up my resources, and building the courage to finally break free from the man I once thought was my salvation. And now, everything had changed. I was carrying his child. My stomach twisted. Images flashed through my mind. My mother sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her eyes distant as she spoke of love and endurance. I saw myself as a child, curled up in bed, listening to the sound of my father's anger echoing through the walls. The feeling of helplessness, of being trapped in a life I didn't choose, came rushing back. I had promised myself I would never be like her. But now, I wasn't just choosing for myself. I was choosing for someone else. The weight of that realization pressed down on me. I needed air. The streets of Boston were cold that evening, the early signs of winter creeping in. I walked without direction, my mind a blur. The city had always been my escape. Fast-paced, unforgiving, a place where I could lose myself among strangers. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't outrun the truth. I was pregnant with Aaron's child, and I had to leave him. I didn't remember texting Claire, but somehow I found myself at her apartment, sitting on her couch with a cup of tea between my hands. She watched me carefully, her usual sharp wit replaced with quiet concern. "When did you find out?" she finally asked. "An hour ago," I murmured. She let out a slow breath, setting her mug down. "And Aaron?" "He doesn't know." Silence stretched between us. Claire was one of the few people who saw Aaron for what he truly was. She had never liked him, never said it outright, but I saw it in the way her expression tightened whenever his name came up, in the way she hesitated before asking me how things were going. She had seen the warning signs long before I was ready to, and now I could see them too. "I can't stay," I whispered. Claire's eyes softened. "No, you can't." I looked down at my hands, my grip tightening around the mug. "But what if I'm making a mistake? What if—" She cut me off gently. You're not your mother." A lump formed in my throat. "I know what you're thinking," she continued. "That maybe he'll change, that maybe having a baby will make things different, but it won't, you know that." I did. I had spent my whole life waiting for my father to change. He never did. Neither would Aaron. Still, when I finally told him, a small stupid part of me wanted to believe his reaction would be different. He had been furious when I came back from visiting my mother. I had expected that. But when I sat him down, took a deep breath, and told him I was pregnant, everything shifted. The anger drained from his face, replaced by something almost reverent. He dropped to his knees, pressing his hands against my stomach, as if he could already feel the life growing inside me. His eyes were bright, his voice trembling. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby." I swallowed hard. He looked up at me, his expression raw, open. "This changes everything, Emilia. I'll be better. I swear to you, I will. I won't lose my temper anymore. I'll go to therapy, whatever it takes. I'll be the man you need me to be." I wanted to believe him. I did. However, love should not be built on promises of change. I had heard these words before, from my father to my mother, and I knew how this story ended. That night, while Aaron slept beside me, one arm draped protectively over my stomach, I made my decision. I wasn't going to raise my child in a home filled with fear. I wasn't going to let my son or daughter grow up the way I had, watching their mother shrink, waiting for the inevitable outburst, mistaking control for devotion. I wouldn't let history repeat itself. The next morning, I called a lawyer. The process was complicated. I needed a plan, an exit strategy. I met with Claire in secret, mapping out my options. She put me in touch with people who could help. Resources for women escaping abusive relationships, legal protections, and financial guidance. I told Josh too. He had always been the level-headed one, the steady presence in my life. When I confided in him, his face darkened with something I rarely saw: rage. "You're getting out," he said firmly. "And we're going to make sure he can't touch you." For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. I wasn't alone. I was leaving. And this time I wasn't looking back. The night was eerily quiet. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the city itself was holding its breath. The suitcase sat by the door, packed with only the essentials: clothes, documents, the ultrasound photo I had tucked between the pages of my notebook. My hands trembled as I checked my phone again. Claire's last message was simple: "I'm outside. Whenever you're ready." I was ready. I reached for the handle when a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. My breath caught in my throat. Aaron. I knew it before I even saw him. The way my body tensed, the way my pulse pounded in my ears, it was instinct now. A warning system finely tuned after months of living in fear. Another knock, more forceful this time. I took a shaky breath and stepped back, pressing my hand against my stomach as if to shield the child growing inside me from what was about to happen. "Emilia, open the door." His voice was eerily calm, but I could hear the restraint beneath it. like a thread pulled too tight, moments away from snapping. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to sound steady. You should go, Aaron. Silence. Then, you're leaving me. It wasn't a question. I gripped my phone tighter, my thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Yes. A low, bitter laugh drifted through the wood. For what? You think you're better off without me? I didn't answer. The doorknob rattled. Let me in, Emilia. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I stood my ground. My voice was quiet but firm. No. A loud bang. I jumped as he slammed his palm against the door. Don't do this, he pleaded, his voice breaking. Please, we have a baby now. This changes everything. For a split second I hesitated, because part of me wanted to believe him. That maybe the fear in his voice was real. That maybe this time he meant it. That the child growing inside me could somehow turn him into the man I once thought he was. But I knew better. I had spent years watching my mother believe in second chances that never came. And I had promised myself I would not be her. I took a breath. I'm not staying, Aaron. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Then the thread finally snapped. The door burst open with a violent crash, the chain lock snapping like it was made of paper. Aaron stormed in, his eyes wild, his breath ragged, and suddenly the room felt too small. I took a step back. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs. You're making a mistake, he seethed, voice low and dangerous. You don't get to just walk away from me. My fingers tightened around my phone. My heart told me to run, but my mind whispered, stay calm. Keep him talking. I took another step back, carefully and measured. You're scaring me. His face twisted. Scaring you? He let out a sharp laugh. You're the one tearing our family apart. Family. I had spent my whole life longing for one. But not like this. Never like this. I exhaled slowly. You need to leave. Aaron's hands curled into fists, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. His eyes darted to the suitcase and something shifted in his expression. You had this planned, he realized, his voice barely above a whisper. You were never going to let me be a father. My stomach clenched. I was never going to let you hurt our child. That was the breaking point. Aaron lunged. But I was ready. I pressed record. The phone in my hand captured everything. The threats, the venom in his voice, the fury in his movements. His hands never reached me. The blaring sound of sirens cut through the air like a blade. Aaron froze. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, and heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. The door, hanging off its hinges, burst open again, this time revealing two uniformed officers, their guns drawn. Aaron turned to me, his face pale. You called them? I met his gaze. I had to. The next few moments blurred together. The officers barked orders. Aaron resisted, and then cold metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. It was over. I stood frozen as they led him away, his voice calling out my name one last time. Emilia, please, don't do this. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched. And when the door finally closed behind him, when the silence settled in his absence, I exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding my entire life. Claire stepped inside, wrapping a warm coat around my shoulders. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I took one last look at the wreckage around me. The shattered lock, the broken pieces of a life I was never meant to keep. Then I placed a protective hand over my stomach, and I whispered, it ends with me. My child will never have to live like I did. The city felt different now. The same streets I had once wandered, lost in my own thoughts, now felt lighter under my feet. The weight that had pressed against my chest for years was gone. Boston had always been a place of transition for me, somewhere I had run to, rather than truly lived in. But now it was home. Because I was free. A full year had passed since that night. The night I ended a cycle that had existed for far too long. The night I chose myself. And the night I chose her. The apartment was small, but it was ours. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting golden patterns across the wooden floors. Toys littered the rug, remnants of a morning filled with laughter and tiny stumbling steps. I glanced toward the crib in the corner, where my daughter Lily stirred in her sleep. Her tiny fingers curled into a fist, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She was safe. I had spent so many months preparing for this, learning how to be a mother, and how to rebuild my life from the ground up. There were nights when exhaustion weighed me down, when doubt crept in, whispering that I wasn't strong enough, that I was doing this all wrong. But then I would look at her, and I would remember why I had fought so hard. Josh and Claire had been my anchors through it all. They had shown up when I needed them the most and had held my hand through every difficult moment. Josh, ever the planner, had helped me find legal support, ensuring Aaron would never come near me again. Claire had been my emotional backbone, reminding me that healing wasn't linear and that it was okay to take things one day at a time. "You're different now," Claire had told me over coffee one afternoon. "Lighter, like you finally believe you deserve this life." I smiled then because for the first time I did. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the anger to surface, for the apologies that would never be real. I had stopped making excuses, stopped shrinking myself to fit into someone else's expectations of love, stopped mistaking control for care. I had learned how to exist without fear. And most importantly, I learned how to love myself. It wasn't easy. Some days, the scars of the past still whispered doubts into my mind. But every time they did, I reminded myself that I had already survived the worst. And I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. I glanced at the clock. Almost time for our afternoon walk. Lily stirred again, her tiny lips parting in a sleepy yawn before her big curious eyes fluttered open. The moment she saw me, she broke into a toothless grin, reaching out with chubby hands. I scooped her up, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. She smelled like baby lotion and warmth like innocence untouched by the darkness of the world. She would never know what it felt like to be afraid in her own home. She would never wake up to the sound of shattering glass, never flinch at a raised voice, never learn to measure love by how much pain she could endure. She would grow up knowing that love was supposed to be safe. I held her close, breathing her in, letting the moment settle deep into my bones. And then, in a voice just above a whisper, I said the words I had been waiting to say for so long. "I did this for you, Lily, so you would never have to live the way I did." Outside, the world moved on. Cars honking in the distance, the hum of life continuing as it always did. But here, in this little apartment, in this life I had built from the ashes of my past, everything was still. And for the first time in my life, I felt whole. The past does not define me. It lingers like a shadow stretching behind me, but it no longer holds me captive. I used to believe that love was something to endure, something that required sacrifice, even at the cost of myself. I watched my mother live that way. I nearly followed her path. But standing here now, holding my daughter in my arms, I know I have rewritten the story. I have broken the cycle. There is no fear in my home. No whispered apologies after nights of anger, no waiting for things to change that never will. There is only peace. Healing is not linear. Some nights I still wake up with echoes of the past ringing in my mind. But when I look at Lily, her wide, curious eyes taking in the world with wonder, I know that I have done what I set out to do. I have given her a future untainted by the wounds of my past. This is what freedom feels like. Not just the absence of chains, but the ability to choose a life that is truly mine. I am no longer surviving, I am living. And that more than anything is my victory.